James had always believed that peace wasn't found in grand gestures, but in the quiet details of life. For him, that peace came each morning, when he stepped onto his porch with a cup of hot coffee and watched. The sun climbed slowly over the lake. The water caught every shade of light, turning gold, then silver, then blue as the day stretched forward. It wasn't just a lake to him, it was part of his family's story, something his father had once cared for with the same devotion James now carried. As a boy, James had spent countless hours here, fishing, skipping stones, and learning from his father how to manage the old dam that controlled the water level. Those lessons stayed with him. Now, as a man, he kept that same rhythm alive, checking the dam regularly, maintaining the shoreline, and ensuring the lake remained healthy. Neighbors often admired the view, saying he was lucky, and James always smiled, quietly proud but never boastful. For years, the HOA left him alone. He was known as the quiet resident who paid dues on time and kept to himself. But that changed when Ms. Carter became president of the association. She was the kind of person who liked rules for the sake of rules. A lawn too long, a mailbox slightly tilted. Nothing escaped her sharp eye. At first, James didn't think much of it. Rules were rules, and he figured she was only doing her job. But soon her focus turned toward him, and more specifically, toward the water that stretched out behind his home. The first letter arrived on a Thursday morning. James pulled it from the mailbox without concern, assuming it was the usual reminder about upcoming dues or community events. Instead, his brow furrowed as he read the bold words. Printed across the page, violation, excessive ownership of water rights. He chuckled, thinking it had to be a clerical error. How could someone own too much water? The lake had been in his family's name for generations, and the deed clearly documented the dam, shoreline, and water rights as his. Yet as days passed, more letters arrived. The tone sharpened with each one, first a warning, then an official fine. Neighbors started whispering during gatherings, lowering their voices when he walked by. Some shook their heads at the absurdity, quietly telling him they sympathized. Others avoided him altogether, unwilling to risk being on Ms. Carter's bad side. What once had been a peaceful, admired property now felt like the target of ridicule and suspicion. James tried to laugh it off, tried to convince himself that common sense would prevail, but the constant pressure wore on him. He noticed the change in himself. Coffee no longer tasted as rich. The breeze off the lake felt heavier, almost taunting. Even the morning bird song couldn't cut through the unease that wrapped around him each time he saw an envelope waiting in his mailbox. It wasn't just about the money, though the fines were steep. It was about the principle. His family had invested years into this land, cared for it long before the HOA existed. He had given his time and effort to make sure the lake remained something the community could enjoy, and now someone was claiming he had too much of it, as if abundance itself were a crime. At HOA meetings, Ms. Carter carried herself with pride, as though she had the entire neighborhood under her command. "No resident is above the rules," she often declared, her eyes flicking deliberately toward James. Her words always earned polite nods from the crowd, though James noticed the unease in some faces. Many knew her claim made no sense, but no one was willing to challenge her authority outright. As the weeks passed, James's peaceful mornings began to feel like a distant memory. He still walked to the water each day, but instead of comfort, he felt tension. Each ripple seemed like a reminder of the conflict closing in. His lake, once his sanctuary, had become a symbol of the storm gathering around him. For the first time in years, James looked out at the water and didn't feel peace. He felt the weight of an inevitable battle. The storm hadn't struck yet, but he could sense it, lingering at the edges of the horizon, waiting for the moment to break. The weeks that followed were nothing short of exhausting for James. What had started as a single letter had grown into a steady stream of fines and accusations. Each envelope delivered to his mailbox carried the same cold message. He was in violation, and the penalties were stacking up. The HOA demanded immediate correction, yet they never explained what correction even meant. How could a man possibly own less water? James wasn't one to lose his temper easily, but the absurdity of it gnawed at him. One evening, he cleared his kitchen table and spread out the documents he had kept carefully stored since the day he bought the property. Deeds, maps, legal papers, all neatly organized, proof of ownership that no one could deny. The lake was his, the dam was his. The water rights, signed and sealed, belonged entirely to him. Yet every time he looked at those papers, frustration rose in his chest. Facts didn't seem to matter to Ms. Carter. She wasn't interested in what the documents said. She was interested in control. And she wielded it with precision, holding neighborhood meetings where she paraded his case as if it were an example for everyone else. At one meeting, James sat in the back as Ms. Carter stood confidently at the front. "No one," she declared, her voice echoing through the hall, "is above the community rules. When residents attempt to overstep boundaries, it threatens the balance we've worked so hard to build." Her gaze swept across the room, but it lingered on James for just a moment longer. Murmurs filled the air. Some nodded obediently, unwilling to challenge her authority. Others glanced at James with a mixture of pity and curiosity. He could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on him. His hands tightened around the papers he carried, but he didn't speak. Not yet. Outside of the meetings, things only grew worse. Ms. Carter began bragging openly to her circle of friends, saying she would make an example out of him. James heard about it from a neighbor who still had the courage to speak to him. "She says she'll break you," the neighbor whispered, his eyes darting nervously toward Ms. Carter's house. "She wants to show the rest of us that nobody gets special treatment." James tried to focus on his daily routines, but the pressure followed him everywhere. Even when he sat on the porch at dawn, coffee in hand, the beauty of the lake was overshadowed by a constant knot in his stomach. He couldn't look at the water without thinking of the fines piling up, the whispers growing louder, and Ms. Carter's smug smile. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Ms. Carter, full of confidence and pride, declared she would be hosting a grand garden party at her property by the edge of the lake. She sent out invitations to nearly every household, boasting about it at every opportunity. She called it a celebration of community unity, but James saw it for what it really was, a stage she had built for herself, an opportunity to humiliate him in front of everyone. The news spread quickly, and soon the neighborhood buzzed with excitement. People spoke about the party as if it were the event of the season. James listened quietly, but inside he felt a storm building. The thought of Ms. Carter hosting a lavish event beside his water, while fining him for owning it, was more than insulting. It was the final straw. The night before the party, James walked down to the dam. The air was cool, the sky dotted with stars, and the gentle hum of water filled the silence. He rested his hand on the old steel lever, feeling the weight of it under his palm. For years, he had treated the dam with care, opening it only when necessary, always mindful of its power. But tonight, as he stared at the water shimmering in the moonlight, a different thought crept into his mind. He imagined the party, the laughter, the glasses clinking, Ms. Carter's triumphant smile. He imagined her boasting about her authority, surrounded by neighbors nodding politely. And then he imagined the rush of water, the roses bending, the tables floating, the laughter turning into gasps. For the first time in weeks, a small smile tugged at his lips. The water was his. The dam was his. And if Ms. Carter wanted to remind the neighborhood who held power, James had the means to remind her of a truth she couldn't ignore. The stars reflected on the lake as he stood in silence, his decision slowly hardening in his heart. Tomorrow would not go the way Ms. Carter planned. The morning of the party broke bright and warm, the kind of day that seemed hand-picked for celebration. The neighborhood stirred with excitement as cars lined the street near Ms. Carter's house. Guests stepped out dressed in summer finery, carrying bottles of wine and trays of food, their voices blending into a cheerful buzz. From his porch, James could see the fluttering white tents, the balloons swaying in the breeze, and the sparkle of glasses catching the sunlight. Miss Carter had spared no expense. Tables were arranged neatly on her lawn, draped in crisp linens, adorned with roses freshly cut from her prized garden. The scent of blooming flowers mingled with the aroma of roasted meats and sweet pastries. A string quartet played softly in the background, their music weaving through the laughter of guests. Everything about the scene screamed triumph. Miss Carter glided among her neighbors, like a queen at her coronation, pausing often to accept compliments and nod with practiced grace. James watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. To anyone else, he looked calm, almost indifferent. But beneath that still exterior, his mind was sharp, focused. Every detail of the dam had been checked twice. He knew exactly how the mechanism would behave, how the water would flow, and how long it would take for the rush to reach her garden. Neighbors greeted him politely. When they passed his property on their way to the party, though their eyes carried questions they didn't ask aloud. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with curiosity, but most simply pretended everything was fine. James offered polite nods in return, saying little. By late afternoon, the party was in full swing. Miss Carter stood at the center of the crowd, raising her glass. "This is what true leadership looks like," she declared proudly, her voice carrying over the music and laughter. "A community where rules are respected and balance is preserved. Together we thrive." Her words earned cheers and applause, and she smiled broadly, soaking in the admiration. But at that very moment, James had already left his porch. He walked steadily toward the dam, his steps slow but certain. The sun glinted off the steel lever as he approached, its worn handle cool beneath his hand. For a brief second he hesitated. Doubts flickered. Was this too much? What would his father have thought? Then the image of Miss Carter's smug smile filled his mind, followed by the stack of envelopes, the weight of fines, and the humiliation he had endured. His jaw tightened. With a steady pull, he opened the dam. At first, the water slipped through like a whisper, a low rush that hardly seemed threatening. But within moments, the stream gained strength, building into a surge that coursed down toward the garden. It was a force of nature, smooth, powerful, unstoppable. Back at the party, the first signs were subtle. Guests laughed as the ground near the tables dampened. A child pointed at the edge of the lawn, shouting, "Look, water!" People chuckled, thinking it was nothing more than a spill, but the chuckles quickly faded as the trickle turned into a steady flow. Chairs tipped, shoes sank, and the edges of white linens darkened with muddy streaks. The music faltered as the quartet scrambled to move their instruments. Gasps replaced laughter. A woman shrieked as the stream rose, swirling around her ankles. Balloons tugged loose, drifting into the sky, while flower arrangements toppled into the growing tide. The roses Ms. Carter had boasted about just that morning bent and broke, their petals scattered across the murky water. Through it all, Ms. Carter stood frozen. Her once confident smile collapsed into disbelief. She clutched her glass tightly, watching as her perfect party unraveled before her eyes. The admiration she had commanded only minutes ago turned into murmurs of confusion and alarm, and James, standing calmly at the edge of his property, simply watched. There was no gloating in his face, no raised voice or mocking grin. He didn't need to say anything yet. The water spoke louder than words ever could. What had been a scene of pride and authority was now chaos, and this was only the beginning of Miss Carter's reckoning. The rush of water slowed gradually, leaving behind a scene that looked nothing like the pristine celebration of only an hour ago. Miss Carter's once perfect garden was now unrecognizable. Mud streaked across the lawn in wide swaths. Tables lay overturned like fallen soldiers, and soaked decorations floated aimlessly in shallow pools. Guests stood in stunned silence, their shoes heavy with muck, their carefully pressed clothes spattered and ruined. The scent of roses was gone, replaced by the damp, earthy smell of churned soil. Miss Carter herself stood at the center of it all, her white dress stained brown at the hem, her glass of champagne still in hand, though its contents had long since spilled. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together, as though she could somehow will the scene back into order. But there was no mistaking what had happened. Her grand party, her symbol of control and pride, had been washed away in a single surge. The murmurs began slowly among the guests. Some whispered in disbelief. Others chuckled under their breath, unable to suppress the irony. The woman who fined James for owning too much water had just seen her own celebration drowned by the very resource she had tried to control. A few neighbors even glanced toward James, who stood calmly near the edge of his property, his posture steady, his expression measured. He didn't rush forward or raise his voice. Instead, he stepped onto the lawn with quiet confidence, holding a folder in his hand. The crowd instinctively turned toward him, their curiosity piqued. He stopped within view of everyone, opened the folder, and raised a single document into the air. "This," James said evenly, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed gathering, "is the deed to my property. It includes this land, the dam, and every drop of water in the lake." He lowered the paper slightly, his gaze sweeping across the faces staring back at him. "For weeks I've been fined for owning too much water. So today," he paused, letting the words settle like stones in the silence, "I thought I'd share a little of it." A ripple of laughter broke through the crowd, quiet at first, then louder as the absurdity sank in. Guests exchanged looks, some nodding in approval, others smiling openly at the simple but undeniable truth. Ms. Carter's face flushed red, her lips parting as if to respond, but no words came. Every eye was on her, waiting for an explanation she couldn't give. For the first time in weeks, James felt the tension in his chest release. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. He was simply standing in his truth, backed not by pride or arrogance, but by undeniable proof. The power Ms. Carter had tried to wield so forcefully now looked flimsy against the weight of reality. One of the neighbors, an older man who had lived there longer than most, finally broke the silence. "He's right," the man said firmly, gesturing toward James. "That lake has always been his. His family cared for it long before the HOA existed. If anyone has authority here, it's him." Others nodded in agreement. The quiet sympathy they had once hidden now surfaced boldly. The balance of the gathering had shifted. Miss Carter, who only hours earlier had basked in admiration, now stood small and diminished before her neighbors. James tucked the deed back into his folder and turned toward his property. He didn't need to say more. The water had done the speaking for him, and the truth had been witnessed by everyone present. As he walked away, the murmur of voices followed him, not whispers of pity this time, but words of respect. That evening, as the sun set and painted the lake in shades of gold, James sat once again on his porch. For the first time in weeks, the coffee in his hand tasted rich, the breeze felt light, and the water looked peaceful. The ripples no longer reminded him of conflict. They reminded him of strength, of resilience, of the power of standing firm when it mattered most. From that day forward, no more letters arrived in his mailbox. The fines stopped. The HOA, once quick to pressure him, seemed to retreat into silence. And Ms. Carter, though she remained president in name, never quite regained the iron authority she once flaunted. Her pride had been washed away along with her party, and the neighborhood never let her forget it. James didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate her downfall. Instead, he cherished the return of peace. The lake sparkled again, steady and unbothered, as if it too had been waiting for this moment of balance. He realized then that peace doesn't always come from avoiding storms. Sometimes it comes from facing them head-on, standing your ground and letting the truth flow, like water breaking free.